I'm Jeffrey W. McClurken, a professor of history and American studies at Mary Washington. Graduated in 1994. I mean, I was a student in his class, but of course, I'd heard about him long before that semester. People on campus had talked about him, and I'd heard from faculty in the department about him. I mean, the class was, it's almost trite, but it was life-changing, right? You had this sense that you were in the presence of history greatness, right? I mean, he had this booming, powerful voice, this great smile, terrific way of telling stories. Um, yeah, I mean, I think, look, as a history major, I had taken a number of classes in which the civil rights movement was covered, right? But it's one thing to hear about the movement from a faculty member, but there's something fundamentally different in hearing those stories come to life, right? Come to life from someone who has been there, come to life from someone who's physically and emotionally suffered for the cause that you're studying. It's just it's a different experience. It's a transformative experience. Um, you know, I guess there's another way to put it would be to say that as a history major who had every plan of going on to graduate school, to becoming a scholar, to becoming a professor, a teacher myself, there was something deeply powerful about hearing from what was effectively a living legend, right? And a living legend who was somehow simultaneously clearly human as well, right? I mean, he was self-deprecating. He was open about his personal struggles. He would talk, for example, about how he dealt with his jealousy of Martin's fame, right? Just first of all, the fact that he talked about Martin Luther King as Martin, right? That was a constant reminder to us of his ties to the other leaders of the movement. But that he wasn't name dropping. He wasn't trying to just he wasn't using it in some false or pretentious way. He was there. Martin was a friend of his. Dr. King was a friend of his. Um, so he was just always sort of self-deprecating. I mean, he talked through how he agonized about whether or not he made the right decision to stay in jail with the other protesters in Plaquemine, Louisiana, when he could have just paid the court fees and have been at the 1963 March on Washington. And so he sort of agonized about whether it was the right thing to do, even 30 years later, 40 years later, so that sense of both the majesty and the humanity just really just stuck with me. And I hope so. I would say he instilled service, thoughtfulness, honesty, a willingness to confront oppression, a but also a sense of humor and a sense of the need to still laugh and to be human. Yeah, I'd love to think that has influenced my own teaching, but I watched. I mean, there were over 100 of us in each of these classes, and yet you could see people just be affected and be transformed by this, and we talk about it outside of class. For me personally, that experience solidified my desire to be a historian, solidified my desire to represent the perspective of those in the past and in the present. So there's no question in my mind that that I was not the only one who had that kind of reaction to it, because I was sitting with all of my fellow classmates and hearing their reactions and the conversations that we'd have at lunch, or at the dinner table over at what was then Seekebeck. Just having these conversations, it went beyond just a class. It was more than just content. It was, this is going to sound trite, but it was an experience, right? Uh, um, I mean, I think Farmer's legacy on campus and in town, I think, is hard to quantify. I mean, it's easier to point to sort of organizations or institutions or things that are named after him. I think the James Farmer Multicultural Center continues on his legacy. I think the Farmer bust is an important reminder, even if not everyone knows what they're looking at when they walk past it. I think the work being carried on in his name, a lot of the work to create the Aspire concept was really based in his ideas and his work. There have been numerous first-year seminars that have been created about him or with his teachings at the center. Earlier groups have done oral histories with people who worked with him or who knew him. I think, for me, as you point out, I do have this unique perspective, right? Because I was his student, but now I'm back teaching at the school where he taught for almost 2 decades. My time in that classroom was transformative, and so when I had a chance to come back and teach at Mary Washington, I jumped at the chance to try to find ways to remember and honor him, right, for his service to the civil rights movement, but also for his service to a generation of students at Mary Washington. I wanted people to be able to hear that booming voice, to hear his stories as much as possible. It's why I've had 3 different classes over the last decade create digital projects related to Farmer and his work. And I think the work that your group is doing and the work that those previous groups have done mean that through the work of Mary Washington students, everyone can hear James Farmer's words, can read his words, can hear him tell his stories, can come to understand why we honor James Farmer and his legacy. It's central to what I've been talking about, I think. The research paper that I wrote for his class was on President Lyndon Johnson's varied stances, and they varied quite wildly. His stances on civil rights over the years. I won't bore you with the details, but I know that when I turned in that paper, I was very proud of the nuanced story that I had written, the narrative that I had laid out, grounded in the primary sources, that really used LBJ's autobiography, which he wrote after he stepped down as president. Now, I'm enough of a scholar now, and there's been enough time that looking back, given what I now know of primary sources and about Lyndon Johnson, I probably bought into LBJ's retellings of his own past more than I should have, right? He was telling his own story in a way that made him look good. But when I got the paper back, Dr. Farmer the only thing he had written on it was, interesting, this is not the version President Johnson told me when I was in the Oval Office. And so, of course, I had professors tell me I needed to think more critically about my sources before. That was the first time that I'd ever had a professor cite actual interactions with the people in question to indicate how wrong I was. So, and it was, I didn't take it in a bad way. I could hear the tone in his voice, the sort of wry, sardonic tone in his voice, as he was like, that's not what President Johnson told me, right? And so that was the kind of person he was. It was education. It was not indoctrination, right? And so, for me, the fact that we are finding ways to recognize the way that this man brought the civil rights movement to life through that resonant voice, through that wry humor, that deep intelligence, that empathy, right? And in some cases, what amounted to an incredibly raw emotion, right? The emotion of someone who had lived through the movement. So the fact that we're able to celebrate and recognize the life and teaching of Dr. Farmer, whose career as a civil rights leader, I think was complemented by his career as an educator. It's an amazing opportunity and responsibility for all of us, but it's one that I think we gladly take up.